The hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen as I stood there reading the message where my daughter called me a burden she was done carrying. Still, I set the phone down gently, letting that low vibration steady my breathing instead of my anger. As the hum deepened in the quiet room, it felt like it was echoing through all the years I let her cross lines I never defended. While I listened, I realized this sound had witnessed every betrayal I'd excused. The same hum now told me the truth. She wasn't coming back to who she used to be. That's when I decided justice begins the moment a father finally chooses himself. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Thomas Reed pushed open the front door with the side of his shoulder, grocery bags rustling against his jacket as he stepped into the quiet house. The early fall air still clung to him, cool, sharp, carrying a hint of rain. At 66, even a simple grocery trip took more out of him than he wanted to admit, but tonight he felt a small flicker of comfort waiting for him. A warm meal, maybe a classic movie. Silence, good, steady silence. After months of tension with Sarah, he craved nothing more than a night without raised voices or accusations. Just a little peace. He set the bags on the kitchen counter and exhaled, rolling the stiffness out of his shoulders. The house smelled faintly of pine cleaner and the apple-scented candle Maggie had given him last week. He let himself breathe it in, the way someone breathes into a memory of better years. For a moment, he imagined his late wife humming while unpacking groceries, the two of them trading stories about their day. That thought alone softened the edges of the long afternoon. Thomas reached for the refrigerator door, when the front door slammed open so hard the frame rattled. Sarah's voice came first, sharp, jagged, already mid-argument before she even saw him. "Dad, where are you?" Her footsteps pounded through the hallway, angry and fast. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair messy, cheeks blotched red, breathing like she'd run the entire block. "Why didn't you answer your phone?" Thomas stilled. "I was at the store, Sarah. Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right," she snapped, thrusting a crumpled stack of bills onto the counter beside the groceries. "These are overdue. Again. The landlord's threatening me, and I'm not doing this anymore. You need to help me." He blinked at the sudden onslaught. "I've already helped you with rent last month, and the month before." "That wasn't enough," she shouted, stepping closer, her frustration sharp enough to fill the room. "You have savings, Dad. You're just choosing not to use them. You're choosing to let me drown." Thomas steadied his voice, trying to keep the peace even as pressure curled around his chest. "Sarah, you're 34. You have to take responsibility for your life. I can't bail you out every time something goes wrong." Her eyes flashed, something volatile sparking behind them. "Are you serious right now? After everything I've dealt with, after everything you put me through growing up?" She jabbed a finger at the bills. "I'm asking you for help and you're lecturing me." "I'm not lecturing," he said softly. "I'm trying to help you stand on your own. This can't continue forever." That was the moment something in her broke. Her breath hitched, not with sadness but with fury, a deep, simmering kind that rose too fast for logic to catch. She stepped even closer, the space between them shrinking to a handful of inches. "You think you're doing me a favor," she hissed. "You think saying no makes you some noble father." "Please lower your voice," he murmured, feeling the tension coil. But lowering her voice was the last thing on Sarah's mind. With no more warning than a single sharp inhale, she shoved him, hard, sending him stumbling back against the counter. Before he could fully process what had happened, her hand swung across his face with a crack so sudden, so stunning, the world seemed to freeze in the aftermath. The sting was instant, hot, humiliating. "You're an old pig who ruined my life," she spat, the words thrown like knives. "You always have been." Thomas didn't move. He couldn't. He stood rooted to the kitchen tile, stunned in a way he had never felt, not even on the day he buried his wife. His daughter, the child he had carried on his shoulders, taught to ride a bike, stayed up all night with through fevers, had just struck him as if he were nothing more than an obstacle in her way. He stared at her, mouth parted but unable to form a single word. His cheek throbbed. His heart throbbed harder. Sarah didn't wait for a response. She spun toward the door, fury radiating off her as she stormed out of the kitchen, out of the house, slamming the front door so hard the windows trembled. Silence swallowed the room again, but Is time it was nothing like the peace Thomas had hoped for. This silence felt hollow, abandoned. It pressed against him as he slowly lifted his hand to the rising bruise on his cheek. His fingers trembled when they touched it, and the pain, sharp, physical, was nothing compared to what spread through his chest. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at the dented counter edge where he'd stumbled, listening to the distant echo of the slammed door. Minutes. Longer. All he knew was that the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where something sacred had cracked open and couldn't be put back together again. He drew in a slow breath, steady but heavy, as if the weight of the moment were trying to anchor him to the floor. And in that breath, in that stillness, a single truth settled inside him. This wasn't just anger. This wasn't just a bad night. Something had changed between him and his daughter, something he couldn't ignore anymore. And as Thomas lowered his hand from his bruise, the question he never imagined asking himself rose quietly, painfully in his mind. What happens now? The kitchen felt colder once night settled in, as if the slap earlier had pushed all the warmth out of the walls. Thomas sat at the small wooden table, the same place he'd spent breakfast with his children for decades, but tonight it felt foreign, like he didn't quite belong in his own home. A cup of untouched coffee grew darker as it cooled beside him. He wasn't thirsty. He wasn't tired. He wasn't anything except waiting. His phone lay face up on the table, black screen reflecting a faint image of his bruised cheek. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing at it, hoping for the single thing he knew he wouldn't get, an apology. Not a full explanation, not even accountability. Just two simple words, "I'm sorry." He told himself he knew better than to expect that from Sarah. Yet hope, especially a father's hope, was stubborn. The house creaked in the kind of quiet that made every sound feel heavier. The wind brushed against the windows. A car rolled down the street. None of it filled the ache that pulsed beneath Thomas's ribs. A sudden knock snapped him out of the haze. He straightened in his chair, quickly wiping his cheek as if he could hide the swelling from the wood and walls themselves. When he opened the door, Maggie stood there, wrapped in a sweater, concern etched into every line of her face. "Thomas," I heard yelling earlier, "is everything all right?" Her voice was soft, familiar, the kind that usually brought comfort, but tonight it twisted the shame deeper. He managed a small smile, just a little disagreement, nothing serious. Maggie didn't look convinced. Her eyes dipped to the faint red mark forming along his cheekbone. "You sure? I can stay for a bit if you want." "No, no," he insisted gently. "It's late, I'm fine, really." She held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for the truth he refused to offer. Then she nodded with slow reluctance. "All right, but if you need anything, anything at all, you call me." "I will, thank you, Maggie." Once she left, the silence felt even louder than before, like he'd pushed away the only lifeline offered to him tonight. Thomas returned to the table just as his phone buzzed. His heart jolted. Maybe she came to her senses. But the notification cut that hope clean. "Sarah, I need $500 by tomorrow. Don't make this harder than it already is." Not a word about what she'd done. Not a hint of remorse. Just another demand tossed at him like he owed her the world by default. He exhaled slowly, thumb hovering over the screen before he locked the phone. The bruise stung as he clenched his jaw. He wanted to believe she was just overwhelmed, that life had pushed her into a corner and she was lashing out blindly. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The slap hadn't been a momentary loss of control. The entitlement in her words earlier wasn't new. Tonight wasn't a beginning. It was the breaking point of years he had chosen not to see clearly. With a heavy breath, Thomas reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a small tin box his wife had kept. Inside were loose photographs, unorganized, aged at the corners, carrying fingerprints of years long gone. He sifted through them slowly, one after another, the faces smiling up at him from better times. There was Sarah at 6 years old, missing her two front teeth and grinning as she held a dripping ice cream cone. Sarah at 12, arms wrapped around their dog Duke, pride in her eyes. Sarah in her high school graduation gown, his wife's arm around her shoulders, both of them glowing with hope. He pressed his palm against the picture, his chest tightening. How did that bright-eyed girl become the woman who struck him without a second thought? Where had things splintered? Was it after her mother died? Was it small choices, small indulgences he gave her to make life easier, until she grew used to taking without giving? The disconnect be earned. It felt like grieving someone who was still alive. Thomas gathered the photos, returning them carefully to the tin. His hands trembled not from fear, but from something sharper, a mix of sorrow and a slow-building resolve. This didn't happen out of nowhere. It didn't erupt tonight. It had been building, stacking, spreading like cracks beneath old paint. And he had ignored each one because he wanted to protect her, because he was her father, because love made him blind to the damage being done. He sat back in his chair, letting the truth settle inside him. Waiting quietly had solved nothing. Hoping she'd change on her own had only opened him up to more hurt. And being the quiet father, the forgiving father, hadn't saved her. It had enabled her. The phone buzzed again, her name lighting up the screen a second time. He didn't even look at it. Instead, with a slow exhale, Thomas felt something shift inside him. A line he had never crossed before now stood clear and solid. Tomorrow, he decided, he would not be the same man he had been today. Tomorrow, the quiet father would be gone. And whatever came next, he would face it with open eyes. Thomas woke before sunrise, long before the houses on his quiet street even began to stir. The air carried that cold early fall bite that reminded him winter wasn't far away. He moved through the house quietly, not out of caution, but out of clarity. His mind felt strangely steady, like a lake right before dawn, cold but calm. Last night's bruise throbbed, a dull reminder of everything that had come undone. But today was different. He set a skillet on the stove, cracked eggs into a bowl, whisking until the yolks folded into smooth gold. Bacon sizzled beside him, filling the kitchen with the familiar sound of home, one that once meant family, warmth, connection. Toast browned in the old toaster that had survived hundreds of Sunday breakfasts. He brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, steam curling in slow spirals as it filled the air. It almost felt like ritual, but this wasn't a gesture of peace or comfort. This breakfast had a purpose. He arranged everything neatly on the table: plates, silverware, folded napkins, and in the center he placed a single manila folder. Closed, unassuming, silent, but heavier than anything else in the room. By the time he poured himself a cup of coffee, he heard the front door swing open without a knock. Sarah. She walked into the kitchen like she owned the place, like last night had never happened, like the bruise on his cheek didn't exist. Her eyes flicked to the spread, and a triumphant, almost smug smile stretched across her face. "Well," she said, dropping her purse on a chair, "looks like someone came to their senses." Thomas didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting her fill the silence with her assumptions. She pulled out a chair and sat down, brushing her hair back, making herself comfortable in the same seat she'd used since she was a teenager. "You know," she continued, picking up a piece of bacon, "you could have avoided all that drama last night if you just listened to me the first time." Her tone was casual, dismissive, like she wasn't the one who had shoved him, slapped him, called him names that still echoed through his bones. Thomas watched her quietly, every movement measured. "I made breakfast," he said simply. "I can see that," she replied, reaching for the eggs without a hint of gratitude. About time you stopped being stubborn. Her casual cruelty slid off her tongue as easily as butter melts on toast. She didn't notice the way his eyes hardened, not in anger, but in clarity. She had no idea the ground beneath her had already begun to shift. As she reached for the coffee pot, Thomas slid the manila folder across the table. It stopped beside her plate, brushing the edge of her napkin. She glanced at it confused. "What's this?" "Something I want you to look at," he said. Sarah snorted. "Dad, if this is some emotional letter or guilt speech, save it. I don't have time." She stuffed another bite into her mouth, still avoiding the folder. "You should focus on helping me, not lecturing me." Thomas's expression didn't change. "Just open it." The steady firmness in his voice made her pause. She finally lifted the folder, but instead of opening it, she leaned back and narrowed her eyes at him. "Oh, I get it now," she mocked. "You're trying to act tough, trying to teach me a lesson or something." She laughed, but it was sharp, hollow, almost rehearsed. "Please, Dad, you can barely stand up to anyone." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. There was strength in his silence, a weight she wasn't used to feeling from him. Sarah shook her head, dismissive, and set the unopened folder back down. Then she went right back to eating as if this were any other morning, as if she hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The tension thickened, invisible but unmistakable. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was the quiet kind, the kind that comes when someone finally decides they've had enough. Thomas watched her with calm, unblinking eyes, studying the daughter he loved, the daughter he had protected for too long, and the daughter who believed she could hurt him without consequence. She had no idea what she was sitting across from. Because this breakfast wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't even anger. It was the first step in something she couldn't yet see coming. A slow shift toward accountability. A quiet move toward justice. Sarah took another bite, oblivious, unaware, unprepared. Thomas rested his hands on the table, steady and sure. He didn't need to raise his voice or explain his resolve. The folder beside her plate would do that soon enough. For now, he just watched as she chewed, smirking with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She didn't realize the truth, not yet. This breakfast was the beginning, and everything after it would change their lives. Sarah finally reached for the folder, more out of irritation than curiosity. She flipped it open with a dramatic sigh, expecting a lecture written on lined paper or some sentimental rambling about responsibility. But the moment her eyes landed on the first page, her smirk stalled, just slightly, just enough for Thomas to notice. Inside the folder was a neatly organized stack of documents, dates, account statements, screenshots, receipts, 15 years' worth of financial records that mapped out a history she had long assumed he would never piece together. "What is all this?" she muttered, flipping to the next page. Thomas folded his hands on the table. "It's everything I've paid for since you were 19, every bill, every late fee, every emergency loan you promised to return." His tone was steady, not confrontational, but painfully clear. "I spent years thinking I was helping you stay afloat, but all I did was keep you from learning to swim." Sarah scoffed loudly, shaking her head. "Oh, please, every parent helps their kid. That's what you're supposed to do." "And I did," he replied quietly. "More than you ever knew, but at some point helping became enabling." She skimmed the papers again, her eyebrows lifting at the sheer volume. Pages and pages. Thousands of dollars. 15 years of transfers, rent payments, car repairs, school debts she insisted she'd handle but never touched. And in the margins of many pages, his handwriting, notes he'd made late at night, trying to make sense of where his savings were disappearing. Sarah dropped the pages back onto the table with a light thud. "Okay, so what? You kept records, congratulations." She waved a dismissive hand as if she were brushing off dust. This doesn't change anything." Thomas didn't argue. He slid another paper forward, a printed bank statement with highlighted entries. "These," he said softly, "are different." She leaned in, annoyed but begrudgingly interested. Then she froze. Highlighted withdrawals, 4 of them, each identical in amount, each made from his account, each marked with his signature. Except it wasn't his signature. She blinked hard, the color draining from her face. "What is this supposed to be?" "Withdrawals you made," he answered, "using my name." Her throat bobbed in a swallow. "No, I never," but the words stumbled. She couldn't find steady footing in her own excuses. "You probably signed those yourself and forgot. You forget things now." Thomas let the insult land without flinching. "I didn't forget, because I never made those withdrawals. The bank verified the dates and the footage. You were there, Sarah." She stared at the page, her pupils tightening. For the first time all morning the arrogance slipped. The certainty slipped. Fear flickered briefly, small but real. "I didn't steal from you," she insisted, voice sharp but cracking around the edges. "You're twisting this, trying to guilt-trip me, trying to make me look like some criminal." "I'm not trying to make you look like anything," he said. "I'm showing you what happened." Her chair scraped loudly against the floor as she pushed back. "Why are you doing this? Because I yelled at you. Because we fought." Her voice grew louder, trembling as defensiveness turned into frantic accusation. "You're blowing everything out of proportion like you always do." Thomas rose slowly, palms resting on the table for balance. "You drained my savings. You manipulated my willingness to help. And when I couldn't give more, you blamed me for your life falling apart." "That's not true," she snapped. "It is," he said simply. The room felt smaller then, tighter, as though the walls leaned in around them. Sarah stared at him, really stared, and for the first time she didn't see the soft-spoken father who always folded under pressure, who apologized when he wasn't wrong, who gave and gave until he had nothing left to give. She saw a line she hadn't expected him to draw. Thomas slid the folder fully toward her. "You won't repay me in money," he said, voice even. "I don't want that. You'll repay me in consequences, real ones, ones you've avoided for too long." Her breath hitched. "So that's it, you're turning on me, your own daughter." "No," he said. "You turned on us years ago. I'm finally acknowledging it." She pushed away from the table so abruptly her chair nearly toppled. Anger flared back into her eyes, giving her something to hold onto, something stronger than shame. "You're dead to me," she spat, voice trembling with rage. "Do you hear me? Dead." She grabbed her purse, storming toward the door. Her footsteps were hard, fast, uneven, like she was running from the truth still sitting on the table. When the front door slammed behind her, the house shook, but Thomas didn't. He stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the folder she left behind. The pages inside rustled faintly as the draft from the doorway settled. He felt grief rise in his chest, slow, heavy, suffocating. But it wasn't the kind that crumbled him. It was the kind that solidified into something firmer. Resolve. As he watched the door she just exited through, one final truth settled inside him. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. By late afternoon, the house had finally begun to settle back into its usual quiet, but Thomas hadn't. The morning's confrontation replayed in loops, her laughter, the forged withdrawals, her final scream at the door. The silence felt deceptive, the kind that made a person believe the worst had passed when, deep inside, he knew the opposite was true. He was washing the breakfast dishes when a firm knock sounded at the door. Not a neighbor's gentle tap, not a delivery driver's quick pat. This one carried authority. "Wait." Thomas dried his hands and opened the door to find Officer Delaney Brooks standing on the porch. Hat tucked under one arm, expression serious but not unkind. "Mr. Reed?" the officer asked. "Yes." "I'd like to talk to you for a moment. It's regarding a report we received earlier today." Thomas blinked. A report. Brooks nodded. Your daughter, Sarah Reed, came into the station. She said she was concerned for your safety. Then came the words that struck Thomas like a cold slap. She reported you for elder abuse and aggressive behavior toward her. For a few seconds, Thomas didn't speak. Not because he didn't have words, but because his mind couldn't process them. Sarah had lied, but not just an ordinary lie. She had inverted reality, twisted the truth so hard it snapped in half. I abused her, he finally echoed, incredulous. That's the claim, Brooks said. She seemed shaken up, said she fled the house this morning after you became physically aggressive and threatened her. Thomas steadied himself against the frame of the door, the weight of disbelief pressing on his spine. Officer, I didn't threaten my daughter. She was the one who. Brooks's gaze drifted upward, landing squarely on the faint purple bruise rising across Thomas's cheekbone. His expression shifted, not startled but suddenly more attentive. Mind if I ask how you got that? Thomas hesitated, not out of fear of telling the truth, but out of an old, deeply embedded instinct to protect his children from consequences. The instinct of a father, even now. But he exhaled slowly, letting honesty take the front seat for the first time in years. She hit me, he said quietly, last night. Brooks nodded once, the kind of nod that said he'd suspected as much. Can you walk me through what happened? They moved to the living room. Thomas spoke gently, almost reluctantly, explaining how Sarah had barged in, shouted about money, shoved him, slapped him, called him names that no parent ever expects to hear. He explained the breakfast confrontation, the documents, the escalating anger. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth, steady, measured, painful. Brooks listened carefully, arms folded loosely, his expression a mixture of empathy and professional distance. When Thomas finished, Brooks took a breath. Mr. Reed, you understand that what your daughter did last night constitutes assault, and the financial withdrawals you showed her, if she forged your name, that's a felony. I know, Thomas said softly, but she has problems, she's struggling. That may be true, Brooks said, but it doesn't excuse violence or fraud. Thomas looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear but from the heaviness of everything he had been holding alone. I just don't want to ruin her life. Brooks studied him for a long moment. Did you want her to ruin yours? The question landed deeper than Thomas expected. He didn't answer. The quiet between them was broken by a sudden shriek from outside. Dad, Sarah's voice cut through the air, furious, panicked, unhinged. Why is a cop here? What did you tell him? She stormed up the walkway, hair wild, eyes wide, breathing hard like she'd run from her car. You're lying about me. Aren't you? You're trying to make me look crazy. Brooks stepped outside, hands slightly raised in a calming gesture. Ma'am, I need you to stay back for a moment. No, he's making things up, she shouted, pointing at Thomas. I told you, officer, he's unstable. He threatened me. He's twisting everything. But her words came out scattered, frantic, contradicting the calm, rehearsed narrative she had delivered at the station. She hadn't expected Brooks to see Thomas's bruise. She hadn't expected the lie to fall apart so quickly. Brooks turned toward her, voice firm. Ms. Reed, I've already spoken with your father, and I need to advise you that your statements don't align with the injuries he has. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed, panic flashing in her eyes. Ma'am, Brooks continued, I strongly suggest you leave the property for now. This is unbelievable, she screeched, but she backed away, pointing at Thomas with shaking fingers. You'll regret this. You'll regret everything. When she finally stormed off toward her car, Brooks waited until the engine roared down the street before turning back to Thomas. Mr. Reed, he said quietly, I'm going to be honest with you. Your daughter is dangerous right now, emotionally, mentally, maybe financially. You need to protect yourself. Thomas swallowed hard. The words stung not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Brooks put a hand on the rail, his voice low and steady. Think very carefully about what you want to do next." And as the officer walked back to his vehicle, Thomas stood in the doorway, realizing he could no longer pretend this storm would pass on its own. The next morning, the bruise on Thomas's cheek had darkened into a deep violet, a shadow he couldn't hide even if he'd wanted to. Sleep had been thin, stretched over hours of replaying the police visit, Sarah's contradictions, and the officer's quiet warning. By sunrise, one truth had settled inside him. He couldn't keep handling this alone. Not anymore. Nolan Pierce's office sat in an old brick building downtown, the kind of place that looked like it had processed decades of disputes, wills, divorces, business deals, and broken promises. Thomas had known Nolan for years. His late wife trusted him, and Thomas had always respected the man's unshakable calm. When Thomas stepped into the office, Nolan looked up from his desk. He was in his mid-50s, steel-gray hair combed neatly back, glasses perched low on his nose. His voice carried the steady weight of someone who had seen too much and judged none of it. "Thomas," he said, standing to greet him, "you look like you've had better weeks." Thomas managed a tired, humorless smile as he shook the man's hand. That would be an understatement. Once they were seated in the small conference room, the walls lined with framed degrees and dusty legal books, Thomas opened the folder he'd shown Sarah. His hands tightened slightly around the edges as he pushed it across the table to Nolan. "I need you to see this," he said quietly. Nolan spread the papers out, scanning them with the precision of someone who didn't miss details. He flipped through pages, bank statements, screenshots, receipts, the forged withdrawals. The more he read, the deeper the crease grew between his eyebrows. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't shocked, just resolute. "Thomas, these withdrawals she made under your name. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is felony fraud." The word felony hit the air like a heavy stone. Thomas sank back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He'd known it was serious, but hearing it spoken aloud made the room feel smaller. "I don't want to put my daughter in jail," he said, voice rough at the edges. "She's still my child. I want her to stop hurting me. I want this to end." "I understand," Nolan said gently. "But wanting peace doesn't change the legal reality. And it doesn't change the fact that she's escalating. She reported you to the police with a fabricated story. She's attacking your reputation. If she continues, she could drain what savings you have left or get you tangled in criminal accusations." Thomas swallowed hard. The shame of it all pressed into him, the shame of letting things escalate to this point, the shame of admitting what his own daughter had done. "I keep thinking I should have seen this coming." "You did see it," Nolan replied. "You just didn't want to believe it. There's a difference." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just honest. Thomas studied the grain of the wooden table, feeling the ache of a question he hadn't asked yet. "What do I do now?" Nolan leaned forward, folding his hands. "First, you need to protect yourself. And that starts with documentation. Keep everything: texts, voicemails, incidents. The more you gather, the less room she has to twist the truth." Thomas nodded slowly. "Second," Nolan continued, "we need to lock down anything she can access. Freeze joint accounts. Change passwords. Cut every financial doorway she might try to slip through." The words felt harsh but sensible, cold but necessary. Nolan slid a stack of forms across the table, each page marked where Thomas needed to sign. "This will freeze the account she's linked to. It won't punish her. It'll just stop further damage." Thomas stared at the papers for a moment. Signing them felt like crossing a threshold he could never uncross, but doing nothing felt like surrendering the last scraps of control he still had. With a steady but trembling hand, he picked up the pen. One signature. Then another. Then another. Each stroke carved out a mix of guilt and faint relief inside him. Guilt for needing to protect himself from his own child. relief for finally taking a step he should have taken years earlier. When he finished, Nolan gathered the forms, stacking them neatly. Good, this is the right move. Thomas let out a slow exhale. It still feels like I'm betraying her. You're not betraying her, Nolan said firmly. You're finally enforcing consequences, something she's avoided her entire adult life. Thomas absorbed the words. Part of him resisted them, but another part, deep, weary, and honest, knew Nolan was right. As the meeting wrapped up, Nolan paused at the door. His voice lowered, carrying a tone Thomas hadn't heard from him before, strategic, almost warning. Thomas, everything we've done today is defensive. He held Thomas's gaze. But if she continues pushing, if she escalates again, we can do more than defend. Thomas felt something shift in the air, a subtle drop in temperature, a realization that Nolan wasn't just preparing for protection. He was preparing for a counterattack. The days that followed were strangely silent, not peaceful, not calm, just quiet in the way a house feels quiet after something breaks. Thomas spent most of his time in the small office upstairs, the desk lamp glowing late into the night as he sifted through years he wished he didn't have to revisit. Old text messages, emails from banks, screenshots of late-night requests, pleas, demands, guilt-laden paragraphs. Every file he opened brought back memories of moments he had brushed aside, moments he told himself weren't patterns, just isolated incidents. Now, under the harsh clarity of hindsight, each message felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. He opened a folder on his computer, labeling it simply, evidence. Not revenge. Not ammunition. Just truth. He scrolled through message after message where Sarah promised she would pay him back next month, where she accused him of withholding love because he refused to fund her newest crisis, where she claimed emergencies that never quite aligned with reality. The words felt heavier now, soaked in years of emotional manipulation he could finally see clearly. As he compiled the documents, the doorbell rang. Thomas startled, his nerves sharper than before. But when he reached the landing, he saw Jason through the glass panel, standing on the porch holding a bag of takeout. Thomas forced a breath before opening the door. "Jason, I wasn't expecting you." "Yeah, well," Jason said with a small grin, lifting the bag. "You sounded off on the phone yesterday. Thought you might want dinner and company." The simplicity of the gesture pricked at Thomas's chest. He stepped aside. "Come in." Jason talked about work, traffic, Maggie's attempt at growing tomatoes again. Thomas tried to follow, but his mind kept drifting upstairs to the lamp still burning over the open folder. Jason noticed. "You okay, Dad? You seem distant." Thomas hesitated. The truth hovered at the edge of his tongue. He could tell Jason everything right now. The slap, the police, the fraud, the fear. Jason was the kind of son who would stand beside him without question. But the words wouldn't come. Not yet. There was something about saying it aloud to him that made it too real, too final. "I'm all right," Thomas said quietly, "just tired." Jason didn't fully believe it, but he didn't push. "Well, eat something. You look like you haven't slept." Thomas managed a faint smile. "Thank you." After Jason left, the house felt even heavier. The truth between them, unspoken, hung like a weight Thomas wasn't ready to lift. That night, while organizing the last batch of emails, a sharp voice cut through the stillness from outside. Thomas moved to the window slowly, dread curling tight. Under the porch light, Maggie stood on her walkway, arms crossed, her posture tense. Just beyond her, Sarah was on the sidewalk, yelling into the air, angry, frantic, pacing like someone unraveling from the inside out. Maggie's eyes shot up toward Thomas's window when she saw him watching. She mouthed two words, "Be careful." Before he could step outside, Sarah stormed away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. Maggie remained for a moment longer, looking toward his house with deep worry. Thomas nodded once, silently acknowledging her warning. Later that same night, his phone buzzed 3 times in a row. Voicemails. He pressed play. First message, Sarah's voice, low and venomous. You think you can humiliate me, freeze me out, you'll regret crossing me. Second message, louder, angrier. You're not the victim, Dad. You're the problem, you always have been. Third message, unhinged, cracking around the edges. I'm not done with you. Thomas sat perfectly still, the phone glowing in his hand. A chill crawled up his spine, not fear exactly, but realization. This was no longer just emotional outbursts. This was escalation. He forwarded the messages to himself, saved them to the evidence folder, then plugged in the small external hard drive Nolan insisted he buy. One by one, he backed up everything. No loose ends, no risks, no more blind spots. When the files finished transferring, Thomas sat back, letting the reality settle. He had always imagined justice meant punishment, confrontation, anger. But as he looked at the glowing folder, the truth of the last 15 years neatly preserved inside, it hit him differently. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't retaliation. It was protection. Protection from the daughter he never imagined he'd need protection from. As he shut down the computer, the house fell dark, the tension in the air shifting again, something gathering, something inevitable. Tomorrow, Nolan would take the next steps. And Thomas, he realized he wouldn't stop him. The next morning, the air felt sharper, colder, as if the season itself had shifted overnight. Thomas sat across from Nolan in the same quiet conference room where he had signed the account-freezing paperwork days earlier. Today, there was a new single sheet of paper between them, simple, direct, not aggressive but unmistakably firm. A no-contact boundary agreement, drafted with precise legal language. Not a restraining order. Not punitive, but a line in the sand. This is just a boundary, Nolan explained. A step before anything escalates to court involvement. It's clear, it's enforceable, and most importantly, it sends a message. You're not playing the same role anymore. Thomas traced the words with his eyes. His name, her name, the list of citations. No unannounced visits, no demands for money, no harassment, no contact outside approved channels. He swallowed. She's going to take this badly. Nolan nodded. She will, but she needs to know you mean what you say. With a steady breath, Thomas signed at the bottom. The pen felt heavier this time, as if he were signing the end of something he had clung to for too long. By late afternoon, the document had been delivered to Sarah by certified mail. And by early evening, she arrived in person. The shouting started before Thomas reached the front door. You think you can send me legal threats? Sarah's voice sliced through the neighborhood air, loud enough that curtains shifted in nearby windows. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps, clutching the crumpled notice in her fist like it was evidence of betrayal. You actually did this to me, to your own daughter. Thomas opened the door slowly, stepping out but keeping a safe distance. Sarah, calm down. This isn't a threat, it's just a boundary. Oh, shut up with that, she spat. A boundary? You mean punishment, you mean control. That's all you've ever done, control my life. He felt the sting of her words, but not like before. Now he recognized them for what they were. Projection, desperation, fear of losing the one person she could still manipulate. Sarah continued, her voice rising. You think a piece of paper scares me. You think you can just cut me out and I'll disappear. No, that's not happening. A car turned into the driveway. Jason stepped out before the engine even cut off. Confusion and alarm etched across his face as he took in the scene. What's going on? Jason asked, walking quickly toward the porch. Sarah spun toward him. Perfect. You're here. Maybe you can talk some sense into him before he ruins everything. Jason's gaze snapped to Thomas. Dad, what is she talking about? Thomas exhaled, the moment he had been avoiding now standing directly in front of him. Jason, I sent her a no-contact notice. Jason blinked. Why? What happened? Before Thomas could answer, Sarah scoffed loudly. Oh, please, don't let him pretend he's some victim. He's lying about me, making me look unstable. He hit me. That's enough. Thomas's voice cracked, not loud, but firm in a way that silenced the air. Jason's eyes widened. Dad, what happened? Thomas looked at him, the truth sitting heavy in his chest. He hadn't wanted Jason to carry this burden, but the moment for hiding had passed. She hit me, Thomas said quietly. Last week, she shoved me and slapped me. Jason turned slowly toward Sarah, as if hoping she might deny it, apologize, show even a flicker of remorse. She didn't. Instead, she scoffed again. Oh, come on, he's being dramatic, he provoked me, and now he's using it as an excuse to cut me off. She jabbed a finger at Thomas. He's twisting everything. Jason stepped forward, placing himself between them. His jaw tightened, his voice low with disbelief and fury. Sarah, you hit our father. He deserved it, she screamed, the words bursting out before she could stop them. Silence fell, thick, heavy, decisive. Jason's expression hardened into something she had never seen on his face before. You need to leave. Sarah looked between them, realization dawning, not remorse but fear of losing control. You two think you can team up against me. Fine, go ahead, but I'm not done. I'll destroy this family before I let you shut me out. She crumpled the notice in her hand, threw it on the ground and stormed toward her car. The engine screeched to life, tires squealing as she sped down the street, leaving only exhaust and bitterness behind. The neighborhood slowly fell silent again. Jason turned to Thomas, his voice softening. Dad, why didn't you tell me sooner? Thomas felt the exhaustion seep into his bones, the kind that came not from age but from years of carrying a weight alone. He stepped back into the doorway, gripping the frame to steady himself. I thought I could handle it, he whispered. I thought she'd change. Jason placed a hand on his father's shoulder, not pressure, just presence. You don't have to handle it alone anymore. Thomas nodded faintly, closing the door as the last light faded from the sky. Exhausted, but steadier, because for the first time, the truth had witnesses. And the next steps would no longer be taken in the dark. The call came late in the morning, just as Thomas finished washing the breakfast dishes. The number was unfamiliar, but something in his gut told him to answer. Trouble had a way of announcing itself quietly these days. Mr. Reed, a man's voice asked when Thomas picked up. Yes, who's calling? This is Harold Connors. I'm Sarah's landlord. Thomas straightened, gripping the edge of the counter. Is she all right? Harold sighed, a long, tired sound, the kind worn by someone who'd repeated the same request too many times. She's fine as far as I know, but I'm calling because I haven't been able to reach her. For weeks, she hasn't paid rent for 3 months. The words landed like a weight Thomas already knew was coming, but still dreaded hearing. I'm sorry to hear that, Thomas said. I froze the account she used to take money from. She may not have access to funds anymore. Harold didn't sound surprised. Well, she told me you'd be covering her past due balance, but considering what you just said, I figured I should confirm. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. The old Thomas, the man he used to be, would have apologized and paid the rent before thinking twice, but things weren't the same anymore. I won't be, he said quietly. I understand, Harold replied, but I wanted you to know she's close to eviction. I thought a parent should hear it first. Thomas thanked him and ended the call, the silence afterward heavy but not shocking. Sarah was unraveling, losing the supports she'd leaned on for years, supports he had kept in place far too long. He didn't have to wait long for her reaction. Just after noon, her car screeched into the driveway. The door slammed. Footsteps pounded toward the house. Thomas braced himself as she burst through the door without knocking, eyes red, breathing hard, the kind of frantic that came from fear disguised as rage. "Dad, please, please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice cracking at just the right pitch to sound desperate. "My landlord's threatening eviction. I don't have anywhere to go. I need you." Tears streamed down her face, real or rehearsed, Thomas couldn't tell anymore. She reached for his arm, gripping him with shaking hands. "Just pay a little, just this once. I'm begging you." Thomas gently pulled his arm back. His voice was steady, not cruel, but solid. "Not after what you did, Sarah." Her expression shifted instantly, like a switch flipped behind her eyes. The tears didn't stop, but the tone beneath them sharpened. "Are you serious?" she whispered. "You're still holding that against me. It was one mistake, one night. You're blowing everything out of proportion." He shook his head. "It wasn't one night, and you know that." Sarah's breath hitched. Then, like she always did when cornered, she reached for the one weapon she believed could still pierce him. "Mom would be ashamed of you." The words hit him, not as a wound, but as confirmation of how far she was willing to go. "She always said you had a cold heart," Sarah continued, voice trembling, building the story as she went. "She told me you'd abandon us someday, and now you're proving her right." Thomas felt the ache rise in his throat, but not from her accusation. From the memory of his wife, soft-spoken, gentle, who would never have weaponized her love that way. "That's enough," he said quietly. Just then, Jason walked in from the hallway, having heard the last part. His eyes flicked between them, recognizing the tension instantly. "What's happening?" he asked. Sarah whirled toward him, clinging to the dramatics. "Jason, please, talk to him. He's letting me be evicted. He doesn't care what happens to me." Jason stared at her for a long moment, too long, long enough for her performance to fray at the edges. "Sarah," he said slowly, "did you just try to use Mom to guilt Dad into giving you money?" Her eyes flashed wide, offended, cornered, exposed. "I was just saying." "No," Jason cut in sharply. "You were manipulating him again, and you know it." Her mask dropped completely then, leaving nothing but anger. "Oh, of course, you're taking his side now. The perfect son, the golden child. You don't know what he put me through." Jason stepped forward, jaw clenched. "I know enough to see what you're doing right now, and I'm not letting you twist this anymore." Sarah's breath came out in an angry, broken laugh. "You two deserve each other." Thomas watched her unravel, watched the desperation burn into resentment. She pointed toward the door. "This isn't over. I'm going to get legal help. I'll take everything you've got. You'll regret ever trying to shut me out." She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. Her car roared away, leaving a trail of bitterness behind. The house went quiet again. Jason turned to Thomas, voice low with concern. "She's getting worse." Thomas nodded slowly, feeling a heaviness settle into something sharper, clearer. "I know," he said, "and that means this is far from finished." Thomas was sweeping leaves from the porch when his phone buzzed. It was Nalan. The tone in his voice, steady, clipped, business-focused, told Thomas immediately this wasn't a routine update. "Thomas," Nalan said, "I just received an alert from the bank's fraud division. Sarah attempted another withdrawal this morning." Thomas froze, hand tightening around the broom. "Another one?" "Yes," Nalan continued. "She tried to move nearly $800 from your checking account, but since we froze everything last week, the transaction never went through." A mix of relief and sadness washed through Thomas. Relief that the safeguards had worked, sadness that his daughter had come this far. "The bank investigated the attempt," Nalan added. "They've officially flagged her activity as attempted fraud." The words hung there, sharp as broken glass. Even when he prepared for this, hearing it made the wound deeper. Thomas stepped into the quiet of the living room, lowering himself into the armchair. "She's sinking," he whispered, not to excuse her but to acknowledge the spiral. "And she's dragging everything down with her." Nalan softened his tone. "You did what you had to do. You protected yourself." Before Thomas could respond, there was a loud, sudden crash outside, something shattering. Thomas stood quickly and moved to the window. Sarah. She was pacing wildly in the front yard, hair disheveled, face flushed with a rage that had marinated for days. At her feet, the ceramic shards of one of Maggie's gifted garden pots glittered in the sunlight like broken teeth. "You coward!" she screamed toward the house. "How dare you freeze your accounts? How dare you lock me out of everything?" Thomas opened the door slowly, staying on the porch, refusing to be pulled into the gravity of her anger. "Sarah, you need to calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down," she shrieked. "You think you can just cut me off. You think you control me. You think you're teaching me some kind of lesson." "This isn't a lesson," Thomas said quietly. "It's a boundary." "Oh, shut up," she kicked one of the broken ceramic pieces across the yard. "I tried to take what you owe me, what you've owed me for years, and the bank treated me like a criminal." She pointed a shaking finger at him. "You did that. You made them flag me. You attempted fraud, Sarah." The truth hit her like a slap, and for a moment her expression flickered, rage collapsing into something closer to panic. But she recovered quickly, twisting her face into scorn. "You're unbelievable. You think you can just rewrite the story. You think you can paint me as the villain." Before he could answer, the familiar black and white patrol car rolled slowly down the street and stopped in front of the house. The driver's door opened. Officer Brooks stepped out. Again. He adjusted his vest and walked toward them with the tired posture of someone who had hoped he wouldn't be back here so soon. "Ms. Reed," he called, calm but firm, "we received a report of property damage and disturbance." Sarah spun toward him. "Are you serious? Are you actually serious? He called you again." "No," Brooks said. "A neighbor did." Sarah froze, thrown off by the unexpected answer. Her eyes darted toward Maggie's house, and she let out a bitter scoff. "Of course, everyone's against me now." Brooks stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Ma'am, you need to leave the property. You can't show up here screaming. You can't destroy property. This is your second warning." "I'm not leaving until he fixes this," she shouted, gesturing wildly toward the house. "I want access to his accounts. I want what's mine." Brooks shook his head. "He's legally within his rights to deny you access. You're an adult, Ms. Reed." That pushed her over the edge. "I'll take his house then," she screamed, voice cracking under the force of her desperation. "You hear me, Dad? I'll take everything through court. You won't have a roof over your head when I'm done." Thomas felt something inside him, not break but settle. A deep, quiet acceptance that there was no misunderstanding left, no illusion to cling to. The daughter standing before him wasn't just angry. She was unmoored, reckless, and capable of inflicting real harm. Officer Brooks stepped in front of her. "Last warning, leave." Sarah backed away slowly, her glare darting between Thomas and the officer. "This isn't over," she snarled. "You think you can shut me out? I'll destroy you for this." She stormed to her car, slammed the door, and tore down the street, engine roaring like an exclamation mark. When the patrol car finally pulled away, Thomas remained on the porch, shoulders heavy. The autumn air chilled the sweat on his temples. He didn't move until his phone buzzed in his pocket. "Nolan," Thomas answered, voice low. "You saw what happened." "I did," Nolan replied. "Officer Brooks contacted me." Thomas closed his eyes. "She's threatening the house now." There was a short pause on the line, and when Nolan spoke again, his tone carried a level of finality Thomas had never heard from him. "Thomas, it's time we file our own case." Those words didn't feel like aggression. They felt like inevitability. Nolan's office felt colder than usual when Thomas walked in the following morning. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the weight of what they were about to do. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that once he crossed this next threshold, there would be no turning back. Not for him, Not for Sarah, not for their family. Nolan stood at the far end of the conference room, papers spread neatly across the table in a row that looked almost ceremonial. 3 packets, 3 sets of documents, 3 legal actions. "Thomas," he said gently, "everything is prepared. These filings cover property damage from yesterday, harassment over the last several weeks, and the bank's report of attempted fraud." Hearing the list spoken aloud felt like being hit with every moment from the past month at once. The shouting, the slap, the broken pot, the threats, the accusations, the withdrawals, the lies. "My daughter," Thomas murmured, the words scraping out of him. "These charges are against my daughter." Nolan nodded slowly. "I know, it's awful, but it's necessary." Thomas lowered himself into the chair as though he were carrying a century on his back. The documents lay in front of him, his name in the complainant's line, hers in the defendant's. Seeing their names arranged that way made something inside him twist. "Before we move forward," Nolan said carefully, "I want you to understand what this means. This isn't vengeance. This isn't retaliation. This is you saying, enough. You have the right to safety, to dignity, to peace in your own home." Thomas stared for a long moment at the pen beside the papers. The room felt too quiet, taut with the kind of silence that comes before a life-altering decision. He lifted the pen, but his hand wouldn't move. His throat tightened, his vision blurred for a moment. Signing meant acknowledging the truth he'd been avoiding for years, that Sarah W. as no longer the bright, laughing child in the photo albums upstairs. She was a grown woman making dangerous choices, choices that could ruin him if he continued doing nothing. Still, she was his daughter. As his hand trembled, the door opened softly. Jason stepped in, summoned by Nolan at Thomas's request. He sat beside his father, studying him for a moment. "Dad," Jason said quietly, "you don't have to explain anything. I know how hard this is." Thomas swallowed. His voice came out thin. "It feels like I'm betraying her." Jason shook his head. "No, you're not punishing her, you're protecting yourself. You're protecting your home. And whether she sees it or not, you're protecting her from herself too." Thomas blinked, moisture gathering in his eyes. Jason's hand settled on his shoulder, steady, supportive, grounding. With a slow breath, Thomas lowered the pen to the paper. He signed the first document, then the second, then the third. Each signature carved a line deeper between past and present, between enabling and accountability, between who he had been and who he was becoming. When he finally set the pen down, his hand shook. He felt sick, a hollow, aching sickness that sat in the center of his chest, but at the same time, something inside him loosened, an exhale he hadn't known he was holding. Nolan gathered the documents. "I'll file these this afternoon." This afternoon. By then, everything would change. And change it did. Sarah received notice the next day. By evening, the storm began. Voicemails, one after another, flooded Thomas's phone. First came the outrage, then the denial, then the spiraling anger that crossed lines she didn't even realize she was crossing. "You think you're innocent in all this. You think you're some perfect father. You pushed me to this. You made me do things. You froze my life, Dad. You froze everything, and now you're trying to ruin me." Her voice cracked between sobbing and screaming, shifting emotions too quickly to keep track. She said things no one should say on a recorded message, especially someone facing legal action. When the 6th voicemail ended, Thomas couldn't even listen to the next. His stomach churned. He forwarded the messages to Nolan, fingers trembling more from grief than fear. 5 minutes later, Nolan called back. "These voicemails," Nolan said, disbelief in his tone, "she's admitting to things she should never admit to. These are going straight into the evidence file." Thomas closed his eyes. "I didn't want it to come to this." "I know," Nolan answered softly, "but she brought it here, and now you have to defend yourself." That night, as Thomas organized the paperwork for court, he felt both old and strangely strong, exhausted but resolute. His heart was heavy, how could it not be? But beneath that heaviness was something solid, firm, steady, necessary. He wasn't preparing to destroy his daughter. He was preparing to stop her from destroying him. And as he placed the last document into a folder, a quiet realization settled over him. The next time he saw Sarah, it would be in a courtroom. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished floors, clean, orderly, unmoving. Thomas sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Nolan stood beside him, reviewing a thin stack of documents for the last time, calm as ever. Jason sat on Thomas's other side, a steady presence, silent but unwavering. The doors opened. Sarah strutted in. She wore a fitted blazer, makeup carefully applied, hair styled in a way that screamed confidence, or at least the illusion of it. She walked past Thomas without looking at him, chin lifted, lips curled in a smug smile. "Well," she said under her breath, loud enough for him to hear, "this should be easy." Thomas lowered his gaze. Even now, even with everything that had happened, part of him hoped she'd show remorse, hoped she'd step back from the edge. But the coldness in her eyes as she entered the courtroom made one thing painfully clear. She believed she would win. Inside, the judge took the bench, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Everyone stood, then sat. The room fell into the kind of hush only courtrooms know, a hush steeped in truth and consequence. The case was called. Sarah rose with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She spoke first, too eager, too smooth. "Your Honor," she said, voice dripping with practiced hurt, "my father has become unstable. He's controlling, aggressive, and he's trying to destroy my life because I wouldn't let him manipulate me anymore." She dabbed at her eyes even though no tears had formed. "He froze my accounts, cut me off, and now he's filing false charges to ruin me." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. Hearing his daughter paint him as a villain, calmly, convincingly, cut deeper than any slap ever could. But the judge didn't react. She only nodded, jotting down notes. Then Nolan stood. "Your Hun," or, he said, "we have evidence that contradicts every part of Ms. Reed's statement." He walked to the monitor beside the judge's bench and clicked a button. The courtroom filled with the sound of Sarah screaming in Thomas's front yard. Her voice cracked through the speakers, angry, unhinged, threatening. The video from Maggie's porch camera showed her pacing, shouting, kicking the garden pot. Sarah stiffened. "That video is taken out of context," she cried, but the judge raised a hand to silence her. Nolan continued. Next came the bank statements, the ones showing the forged withdrawals. He pointed out the dates, the signatures, the bank's fraud report. The judge inspected each sheet with slow, methodical attention. Sarah's face tightened. Then Nolan handed the judge a copy of Thomas's medical report, the bruise documented by his doctor the morning after the slap. "This," Nolan said, "corresponds directly to Mr. Reed's statement that his daughter struck him." Sarah leaned forward, voice shaking now, not with sadness but with panic. "He bruises easily. He's old. That means nothing." But the judge had already seen enough. Finally, Nolan addressed something Thomas had been dreading. He played the voicemail she'd left, her voice filled with threats, admissions, rage. Every syllable echoed through the courtroom. "You froze my life, Dad. You froze everything. You'll regret crossing me. I'm not done with you." Sarah covered her face with her hands, shaking her head. "Those were private. You can't, he's twisting everything." But her voice no longer held the same confidence. Her story had begun to unravel in front of her. And the judge noticed. After a long, heavy silence, the judge spoke. Ms. Reed, your statements conflict with video evidence, bank documentation, and recorded messages. Your claims of elder abuse are unsubstantiated. Your behavior, however, is concerning. Sarah's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. The judge continued, voice firm, decisive. Mr. Thomas Reed is granted a 1-year protective order. Ms. Reed is prohibited from contacting him except through legal counsel. Sarah gasped, "What, you can't, he's my father." Furthermore, the judge said, unfazed, Ms. Reed, you will attend mandatory counseling sessions and pay fines associated with the fraudulent withdrawal attempts. Sarah's face twisted into something dark, anger coated in humiliation, mixed with hatred so sharp it almost glowed in her eyes. She turned slowly toward Thomas. Her glare cut through him, not physically but emotionally deeply. There was no recognition there, no love, no grief, only blame. Jason shifted beside Thomas, ready to intervene if she moved even an inch closer. But she didn't. She just whispered, low enough that only Thomas could hear. "You did this to me." Thomas's breath trembled, though he tried to hide it. Relief and grief collided inside him, the relief of safety, the grief of watching the last bridge between them burn. When the hearing ended, he rose on shaky legs. Jason steadied him with a hand on his back. "You did the right thing," Jason murmured. Thomas nodded faintly, though his eyes stayed on the courtroom door where Sarah had disappeared. The right thing. Why then did it feel so much like loss? As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of what came next pressed onto his shoulders. The case may have ended for today, but the fallout had only just begun. The fallout began quietly, almost silently, like the slow collapse of a structure whose foundation had been cracking for years. 3 days after the court hearing, Thomas received a call he never expected. It wasn't from Sarah. It was from one of her coworkers, a woman named Denise who sounded nervous just speaking his name. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry to bother you. I shouldn't even be calling, but Sarah didn't show up for work today, or yesterday. Our manager tried calling her, but she didn't answer. And well, after the court order became public record, HR was notified." Thomas closed his eyes. That meant Sarah's employer now knew she'd been charged with harassment, fraud attempts, and placed under a protective order. "Mr. Reed," Denise continued, voice softer now, "they let her go." It wasn't anger he felt, not even vindication, only a deep, slow sadness, like watching a fire burn the last remnants of something that once mattered. He hung up and stared at the silent phone in his lap. Sarah had always been volatile, but she'd worked hard at that job. It had been one of the few stable pillars in her life. Now it was gone. Later that afternoon, another call came, this one from her landlord, Harold. His voice held no frustration now, just resignation. "She's out," Harold said. "We had no choice. I gave her as much time as I could, but the rent hasn't been paid in months. We changed the locks today." Another pillar crumbled. Thomas rubbed his forehead, weariness sinking into his bones. He wanted to ask where she'd gone, whether she was safe, but he knew Harold woe. Aldn't know, Sarah had burned that bridge too. By evening the storm hit. His voicemail pinged repeatedly with messages from Sarah, furious, unhinged, desperate. "This is all your fault. You humiliated me, you cut me off, you cost me my job. You want to ruin my life. Watch how fast it falls apart, you'll be sorry." Every word twisted inward and ripped at him. He could barely listen to more than a few seconds at a time before turning off the phone and staring at the wall, wondering how fatherhood could degrade into this. But it wasn't over. At nearly 9 that night, headlights swept across his driveway. Jason arrived without calling, stepping into the house with a worried look carved into his face. "I saw the notifications," Jason said, holding up his phone. "She's been calling me too, begging, demanding, threatening. She wants to move in." Thomas's breath caught. Did you? Jason shook his head firmly. No, I told her absolutely not, not after everything she's done. She said I was betraying her, that I chose sides. Thomas sat heavily at the kitchen table, the guilt pressing down again like unwelcome gravity. She's losing everything, Jason. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I. No, Jason's voice sharpened. You didn't push. She crossed lines again and again. You finally stood your ground. But she's homeless, Thomas whispered. Jobless. She is, Jason said gently. Because of her actions, not yours. Still, the ache didn't ease. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, Maggie knocked at the front door. She stood bundled in a coat, worry etched deep into her expression. Thomas, she said, lowering her voice, I just saw her. Sarah. She was wandering up Maple Street, pacing, talking to herself. Angry, I called out to her, but she didn't seem to hear me. Thomas's heart clenched. He imagined Sarah alone on a dark street, unsettled, unraveling. Did she have a place to go? He asked. Maggie shook her head. I don't think she does. He closed the door after she left and leaned against it, letting the heaviness seep into him. A father's instinct is to protect, to shelter, to fix, and every instinct inside him screamed to go find her. But the bruises, the forged withdrawals, the threats, the protective order, they all reminded him of one quiet truth. Wanting to save her didn't mean he could. He sat down at his desk upstairs, papers from the court case still neatly stacked. Nolan's steady words echoed from days before. She chose her path, Thomas. All you did was stop sacrificing yourself for it. He breathed out slowly, letting the truth anchor him. He could love her. He could hope for her healing. But he could not destroy himself to cushion her fall. So instead of calling her, instead of breaking the protective order, Thomas turned off the lights and lowered himself onto his bed. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to focus on something small and steady. The quiet hum of the house, the warmth of the blanket, the faint scent of his wife's old pillowcase that he still kept beside him. He wasn't healed. He wasn't whole. But he was beginning. And tomorrow he would continue. Even if Sarah wasn't ready to. The day was gray and wind-heavy, the kind that made bare branches tap against windows like quiet warnings. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of him when he heard the sound he'd come to dread. Footsteps on the porch, fast and uneven. Then 3 hard knocks. Not the hesitant tapping of a neighbor, not the polite rhythm of delivery drivers. A demand. Thomas's breath tightened, but he stood anyway. He walked to the door with steady steps, the kind of steadiness that only comes from exhaustion mixed with clarity. When he opened it, Sarah stood there, disheveled, trembling, and furious. Her clothes were wrinkled, mascara streaked beneath her eyes, hair tangled by the wind. A far cry from the confident, smug daughter who'd strode into court. But the fire in her eyes was familiar. You need to reverse everything, she snapped before he could greet her. All of it. The charges, the protective order, the fraud report, you're going to undo it. Today. Thomas didn't move. Sarah, no. She shoved past him into the living room, pacing like a cornered storm. Do you even understand what you've done to me? I can't get a job. I can't get an apartment. My friends won't answer my calls. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. She spun around, tears burning down her cheeks. Fix it. Thomas closed the door gently and turned to her. I can't fix what you did. She froze. Her breathing hitched. What I did, she repeated, voice rising. What I did. Dad, you signed legal documents against your own daughter. You froze me out of your life and your accounts. You sixed the police on me. You hit me. The room stilled at his words. You hit me, he repeated softly. You lied about me. You tried to take money that wasn't yours. You screamed at me in front of my neighbors. And you've threatened me. Again and again. Sarah shook her head fiercely, as if denying reality could erase it. I only did those things because I had nowhere else to turn. You don't understand how hard everything has been." Thomas stepped toward her, not aggressively, not accusingly, just enough to make sure she heard every word. "And I had nowhere to turn when you were draining my accounts, when you were screaming in my yard, when you slapped me across the face. I was alone, Sarah. I've been alone in this for years." The tears streaming down her face shifted then, from fury into something cracked and raw. For the first time in a long while, she didn't look angry. She looked defeated. She sank onto the couch, face buried in her hands as sobs tore quietly from her chest. "Dad, I didn't know what else to do. The rent, the job, I didn't know where to go." Thomas felt the ache in his chest return, old and familiar. The father in him wanted to reach for her, but the man who had been bruised, manipulated, stolen from, screamed at, the man who finally regained control of his life, knew better. He sat across from her. "I hear you," he said gently. "I do, but needing help doesn't give you the right to hurt people, especially the people who love you." Sarah lifted her head, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Then help me, please. Just help me one more time. If you drop the charges, everything will go back to normal. I swear I'll get my life together." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I won't go back to who I was. I won't be your punching bag again." She stared at him, mouth trembling as though she just realized the leverage she had always depended on was gone. The guilt she weaponized, the obligations she manipulated, the childhood memories she twisted. None of it worked anymore. "You're really choosing this," she whispered, "choosing yourself." "Yes," he said, voice firm, "for the first time in a long time." Silence fell between them, not angry, not explosive, just final. Sarah rose slowly to her feet. There was no rage left now, no fire, no shouts, just a hollow emptiness that had replaced the fury. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Fine," she breathed, "if that's how you want it." She walked to the door, pausing only once to look back at him, not with love, not with regret, but with a coldness that carved into him deeper than any words. Then she left. No slamming door. No screams. Just the quiet click of a latch. Thomas stood in the stillness, the weight of the moment settling across his shoulders. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the emotional toll of letting go of something he'd been trying to save for too long. He walked to the door and closed it gently. No regret. Only grief. And the faintest flicker of relief. Because this, he knew, was the beginning of whatever came next. The house was silent when Thomas woke the next morning, too silent, the kind that makes a man hold his breath without realizing it. He moved through the living room with slow, careful steps, unsure whether he felt lighter after Sarah's final departure or simply emptied. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, trying to let the quiet settle into something peaceful. But the thought of Sarah, alone, furious, spiraling, kept tugging at him. He didn't regret standing his ground, but fatherhood had a way of making even the right decisions hurt. His phone buzzed. An email. From Sarah. The subject line alone made his stomach drop. "You just declared war." He hesitated before opening it, but dread pulled his thumb forward. The message was long, paragraph after paragraph, pouring out like a dam had burst. Every sentence was sharp, frantic, dripping with venom. She accused him of emotional torture, financial sabotage, elder manipulation claims inverted on him, and betrayal beyond what any father should ever be capable of. Then came the threats. "I will sue you for everything you own. I will expose you in ways you never imagined. If you think this ends because a judge believes your lies, you're dumber than I thought. I will ruin you completely." Her rage escalated with each line, twisting into conspiracies and imagined wrongs, building into a crescendo of accusations that didn't sound like a daughter anymore. It sounded like an enemy. Thomas felt his pulse slow, not out of calm, but out of the painful understanding that this was the version of Sarah he'd been avoiding seeing fully for years. He reached the bottom of the letter and froze. In her fury, Sarah had copied 2 additional emails. Jason Reed. Nolan Pierce. She hadn't noticed, she hadn't checked. She sent her threats to her brother and to Thomas's attorney. The room seemed to tilt slightly as Thomas lowered the phone. His chest tightened, not with fear but with heartbreak. Even Jason, who had always tried to believe the best in her, would now see her anger without a filter. A soft chime signaled another incoming message, this time from Nolan. Thomas, do not respond. This is a direct violation of the protective order. I'm forwarding this to the judge immediately. Thomas read the words twice, 3 times, feeling the magnitude settle in. A violation meant enforcement. Enforcement meant consequences, real ones. He set the phone down, breath shaky. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't asked for it. But the law didn't bend for broken families. It only followed evidence. Within an hour, there was a knock at the door. Not the pounding chaos Sarah brought, but the controlled, measured knock of authority. Officer Brooks stood on the porch again, hat in hand, expression heavy. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I need you to stay inside. We received confirmation of a protective order violation. We're bringing Sarah in." Thomas swallowed, throat thick. "Where is she?" Brooks nodded down the street. "She's sitting in her car. We already approached her." Thomas stepped aside to look out the window, staying behind the glass as instructed. 2 officers stood beside Sarah's car. She was yelling. He could hear the muffled echoes through the window, but even through the distortion he recognized the frantic pitch in her voice. She pointed wildly toward his house, insisting she'd done nothing wrong, insisting he had provoked her, insisting she was the victim. But her protests did nothing. One officer opened the car door. The other guided her out. Her resistance weakened when they cuffed her, not with violence but with defeated, trembling hands. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was collapsing beneath the weight of consequences she thought she could outrun. As they led her toward the patrol car, she looked up, right toward the house. Right toward him. Her eyes were wide, disbelieving, glassy, with a kind of wounded fury that made Thomas step back from the window as if he'd been struck. Not because he feared her, but because he mourned her. He had never imagined he'd watch his child be escorted away by police, not in his darkest thoughts, not even after everything she'd done. Jason arrived minutes later, breathless, having driven straight from work the moment Nolan forwarded the email to him. He joined Thomas at the window just as the patrol car doors closed. "Dad," Jason whispered, placing a hand on Thomas's back. "I'm so sorry." Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the fading lights of the police car as it turned the corner and disappeared. "I didn't want this," he finally said, voice breaking. "I didn't want to be the reason she—" "You're not," Jason interrupted firmly. "Dad, listen to me. This might be the wake-up call she needs. She won't stop until something forces her to, and maybe this is it." Thomas's shoulders sagged, the fight leaving him, not in defeat but in exhaustion. For months he had been bracing for the next crisis, the next confrontation, the next blow. But now it felt like the spiral had hit its bottom. He let out a long, shaky breath. "Is it finally over?" Jason squeezed his shoulder gently, grounding him with quiet strength. "Maybe not today," he said, "but the worst of it, I think it's behind us." Thomas nodded, the weight shifting, still heavy but no longer crushing. For the first time in months, he felt something loosen inside him. Not joy, not victory, but the faint, trembling beginning of peace. The house felt different after Sarah's arrest, quieter, yes, but not the brittle quiet of fear. This was a deeper silence, a settling silence, the kind that follows a long storm when the wind finally stops pounding the windows and the walls stop shaking. Thomas woke the next morning unsure what the day would bring, but for the first time in weeks, he didn't startle awake. His chest didn't seize with dread. His hands didn't tremble. He made himself coffee and stood by the window, the soft morning light creeping across the living room floor. The world outside looked unchanged. Same street, same trees, same rustling leaves. But inside him, something had undeniably shifted. By noon, Nolan called with the official update. "Thomas," he said, voice steady, "the judge reviewed the violation. Sarah has been ordered into mandatory counseling, and the protective order remains in full effect. She cannot contact you. No emails, no calls, no texts, no in-person visits. Nothing." Thomas sank slowly into the kitchen chair. "So that's it." "For now," Nolan replied gently. "The court is giving her a structured path to get help. Whether she follows it, that's on her." Thomas thanked him, hung up, and stared at the blank space on the table where Sarah's chaos used to sit. Her demands, her shouting, her ultimatums, they had filled the house like smoke for so long that he'd forgotten what clean air felt like. Now he could breathe. But breathing came with guilt. He spent the next few days struggling with the same question on repeat. Did I push her toward this, or did I just stop cushioning her fall? The answer hovered somewhere in the middle, too complicated to pin down. Eventually, he did what he never imagined doing. He attended a support group at the local community center, a circle of folding chairs, a pot of lukewarm coffee, a dozen strangers who carried similar burdens. Parents of adult children who had cut ties or caused harm, parents who loved deeply and suffered silently, parents who whispered stories that sounded far too familiar. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he hesitated, words thick at the back of his throat. "My daughter," he started, then stopped, the ache rising in his chest. "I didn't realize how long I'd been trying to save her from consequences, and now she's drowning in them." A woman across the circle nodded softly. "You didn't cause her decisions, you just stopped absorbing them." Others shared similar truths, small but grounding. Thomas left the meeting feeling lighter, not healed, not whole, but understood in a way he hadn't been in years. Outside the community center, Maggie was waiting in her car. She waved him over. "How'd it go?" she asked as he climbed into the passenger seat. "I don't know," he admitted. "Hard, honest, necessary." She gave him a knowing smile. Recovery often starts that way. Maggie became a quiet anchor in the days that followed. They walked together in the evenings, her presence gentle but firm. She didn't pry, didn't judge, didn't dissect every detail like some people might. Instead, she reminded him, simply by being there, that not every relationship required survival tactics. "You're stronger than you think," she told him one night as golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk. "Don't let guilt erase the progress you've made." Jason visited often too, more often than he had in years. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't need to. Jason cooked dinner once or twice, claiming he'd found a new recipe online but burning the garlic bread every time. They watched old movies. They mowed the lawn together. They just existed near each other, rebuilding the ease they'd lost in the shadow of Sarah's chaos. One evening, as they sat on the porch with mugs of hot cider, Jason said quietly, "It doesn't feel good to watch someone hit bottom, even when they dug the hole themselves." Thomas nodded. "I keep thinking, maybe if I'd done something different years ago." "No," Jason cut in firmly. "Dad, you did what you could, more than you should have. She made choices. You protected yourself. That's not failure, that's survival." The word struck something deep inside him. Survival. He hadn't thought of his decisions that way before. But now, as the leaves rustled against the porch steps, he couldn't deny it. That night he sat at his desk with an empty notebook in front of him. He opened it, unsure what to write, but feeling compelled to start. The first page stayed blank for a long time. Then slowly he began recording moments, tiny ones, painful ones, years of choices he'd made and excuses he'd allowed, memories that had gnawed at him silently, the things he'd overlooked in the name of love, the red flags he'd painted white. He wrote until his hand ached. He wrote until the guilt had somewhere else to sit besides, inside his chest. And when he finally closed the notebook, he felt something settle, something honest, something steady. This journey wasn't about punishing Sarah. It wasn't even about changing her. It was about reclaiming his own life. His safety. His dignity. His peace. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the quiet hallway, the still rooms, the home finally feeling like home again. For the first time in a long time, he understood. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't cruelty. This was survival. And he had chosen it. Thomas woke before sunrise, but not from fear this time, not from tension, not from waiting for footsteps on the porch or another barrage of messages. He woke because his mind, finally, after weeks of unraveling turmoil, felt clearer. He sat up slowly, stretching joints that reminded him of his age, then walked to the window. The early winter sky was pale blue, quiet, unassuming. A thin frost silvered the lawn. For a moment he let himself breathe in the stillness. And in that stillness, memories rose. Not the recent ones, screaming threats, police lights. Older ones, softer ones. Sarah at 8 years old, running through the yard with a pink kite wobbling behind her. Sarah at 14, begging him to let her stay up late because Mom would have said yes. Sarah at 17, curled on the couch with a blanket after a bad breakup, crying softly while he made her hot cocoa. And his wife, Sarah's mother, smiling at him across the kitchen table, her hand brushing his in a way that told him everything was all right. Then came the darker memory. The hospital room, the sterile smell, the sudden vacuum of losing her, the sharp, unbearable weight of becoming a single father overnight. He remembered the way he tried to fill both roles, mother and father, comfort and discipline, but mostly comfort, always comfort. He couldn't bear adding more pain to Sarah's world when she'd already lost so much. He sat heavily in the living room chair, rubbing his temples. "That's where it started," he murmured. "That's where I let the boundaries break." He hadn't recognized it then. He was grieving. Sarah was grieving. And grief had a way of turning guilt into permission, permission to say yes, permission to look away, permission to fix problems instead of teaching someone to solve them. He hadn't raised a daughter to stand strong. He had raised a daughter he couldn't bear to disappoint. And now, decades later, the consequences had come crashing through every door he'd left unlocked. A soft knock broke the silence. Jason stepped inside with 2 coffees, one hand tucked in his jacket pocket. "Morning, Dad. Thought you might want company." Thomas managed a tired smile. "You didn't have to." "I know," Jason said, "but I wanted to." They sat together at the table, steam rising from the cups between them. Jason studied him quietly, then spoke carefully. "You've been hard on yourself lately." Thomas looked down at his hands. "Maybe I should." "Be." "No," Jason said firmly. "Dad, listen, you loved us. You tried your best. You weren't perfect, no parent is. You didn't create Sarah's choices. You didn't force them. You gave her love and support. She twisted those things, not you." Thomas swallowed hard. "But maybe I made it easy for her to twist." "Maybe," Jason admitted. "But forgiving yourself doesn't depend on being perfect. It depends on being honest, and you're finally doing that." Silence settled between them, warm, reflective, not painful. Jason squeezed his father's shoulder. "You can't rewrite the past, but you can stop letting guilt dictate your future." After Jason left, Thomas wandered through the house, seeing it with new eyes. Every room held remnants of the life he'd once built for his family. Photos, trinkets, boxes tucked into corners, dusty shelves filled with things he hadn't touched in years. He started in the attic. Old boxes lined the walls, some from when he and his wife first moved in, others packed hastily after she died, when he couldn't bear to deal with anything but survival. He opened the first box and felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. His wife's old scarf, handwritten recipes, a half-finished scrapbook she'd started for the kids. He sat cross-legged on the attic floor, sifting through the items slowly. He allowed himself to feel everything: the loss, the sweetness, the ache, the memory of who he used to be before life reshaped him. Hours passed as he moved from box to box, rediscovering pieces of himself he didn't realize he'd buried. A younger version of him, a hopeful version, a man who loved deeply and lived fully. By afternoon, the boxes were sorted into keep, donate, and discard piles. He wiped his forehead and felt a surprising lightness, like clearing the attic had cleared something inside him too. The next day, he redecorated. He painted the living room a soft, warm cream, replaced the heavy curtains with sheer ones that let the sunlight spill in, rearranged furniture the way his wife used to like it: open, airy, welcoming. He placed fresh flowers on the coffee table, lit a candle that smelled of pine and citrus. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a museum of the past. It felt alive. It felt like his. As he stood in the doorway, looking over the refreshed room, he felt a gentle peace settling across him. Not the forced peace he used to pretend. Not the brittle peace that shattered with every crisis. A true calm. He sat down with his journal, once intimidating, now almost comforting, and wrote slowly, deliberately. Healing doesn't happen when the storm ends. It begins when you allow yourself to rebuild. When he closed the notebook, a quiet certainty washed over him. For all the pain, all the heartbreak, all the loss, this was the beginning of healing. And this time, he wasn't healing for Sarah. He was healing for himself. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, gentler, steadier, the kind of rhythm Thomas hadn't felt in years. Winter had crept in fully now, laying a thin frost across the windows each morning. Thomas would wake early, make coffee, open his journal, and write small truths he'd never allowed himself to face before. Healing was slow, uneven, but real. One late afternoon, just as he finished sweeping the kitchen floor, he heard the mail slot clatter. A single envelope slid onto the rug, white, official-looking, with a Counseling Center's logo printed in the corner. His breath paused. He picked it up carefully, turning it over as though the weight of it might shift. When he opened it, a short letter unfolded in tidy handwriting, not Sarah's, but her counselor's. Mr. Reed, I want to inform you that Sarah has been attending her mandated sessions consistently. She is showing early signs of insight and emotional regulation. Progress is slow, but present. She has also expressed a desire to take accountability and has prepared a brief written statement for you, submitted through approved court channels. Thomas lowered the letter slowly, unable to tell whether relief or anxiety had hit him first. The idea that Sarah was improving, really improving, felt like a door opening somewhere deep in his chest. But the idea that she had something to say to him, that stirred something more complicated. At the bottom of the envelope was a smaller folded page, marked with the court stamp. Her apology. He sat down at the kitchen table, steadying himself before unfolding it. Dad, I know I caused a lot of pain. I know I crossed lines I shouldn't have. I am trying to understand why I acted the way I did. I won't ask for anything right now. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. The note was short, simple, no excuses, no demands, just a handful of sentences that felt strangely fragile. Thomas read it twice, then again. He didn't cry, he didn't tense. Instead, a quiet confusion settled into him. He wanted to feel relief. He wanted to feel forgiveness. Instead, he felt unsure. After everything had happened, after months of chaos, betrayal, legal battles, how did a few lines unravel such a complicated knot? As he sat there staring at the paper, the door opened and Jason stepped inside, brushing the cold from his jacket. "Hey, Dad," Maggie said she saw the mail come. "Anything important?" Thomas handed him the counselor's letter and the apology. Jason read them both, his expression softening. "Wow," he murmured, "that's something." "It is," Thomas said quietly. "I just don't know what to feel." Jason pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "You're not supposed to feel just one thing. She hurt you deeply. An apology doesn't erase that." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Forgiveness doesn't mean reopening the door. It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending everything is normal." Thomas sighed, rubbing his thumb across the edge of the paper. "Then what does it mean?" "It means acknowledging her effort without sacrificing your healing," Jason said. "You can wish her well without letting her hurt you again." Those words settled into him slowly, like warm water soaking into cold hands. Later that evening, Thomas sat at his desk with a blank response form, one the court required for any communication. He stared at the empty space for a while, thinking about all the words he could write. Words about pain, about loss, about fear, about love and disappointment intertwining until they were impossible to separate. But in the end, he wrote only 2 words. "Heal first." Clear, respectful, boundaried. He sealed the response and placed it by the door for morning pickup. 2 days later, he received confirmation from the court. Sarah acknowledged the message. She accepted the boundary. For the first time since everything began, Thomas felt something loosen inside him. Not a dramatic release, not overwhelming joy, but a gentle, undeniable lift. As he sat quietly in the living room, evening light spilling across the floor, he realized something profound. He wasn't waiting for the next crisis anymore. He wasn't bracing. He wasn't drowning in guilt. For the first time in years, the weight was lifting, and healing, real healing, finally felt possible. Thanksgiving arrived with a crisp wind and a sky the color of pewter, the kind of late autumn day that made the air smell faintly of wood smoke. Thomas drove slowly to Jason's house, the roads lined with bare trees and the last drifting leaves of the season. For years, holidays had carried a quiet tension, an unspoken fear of how Sarah might behave, what demands she might make, what explosion might shadow the day. But this year felt different, still tender, still uncertain, but different. When he stepped onto Jason's porch, he heard soft laughter inside, warm, familiar, uncomplicated. He knocked once before opening the door, greeted immediately by the smell of roasted turkey, thyme, and Maggie's famous cornbread. "There he is," Jason called from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Right on time." Maggie appeared behind him, cheeks flushed from the oven's heat. "Happy Thanksgiving, Thomas," she said, brushing a gentle hand on his arm as she passed. The house felt alive, soft lights glowing, music low in the background, the table set with mismatched plates and cloth napkins folded neatly. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't perfect, it was sincere, and that alone made Thomas's chest warm. He hung his coat and joined them as Jason carved the turkey, humming to himself. Maggie arranged the side dishes, shooing Jason's hand away when he tried to steal a piece of cornbread. "Dinner's on the table in 2 minutes," she said. "Sit before you faint from hunger." They gathered around the small dining table. Jason bowed his head briefly, offering a quiet moment of thanks, nothing formal, just a breath of gratitude. Thomas took in the warm glow of the candles, the gentle clink of dishes, the absence of tension. For the first time in years, he wasn't bracing for conflict. He wasn't waiting for a door to burst open or a demand to be hurled across the table. For the first time in years, he felt safe at a holiday meal. When they were halfway through dinner, Jason raised his glass and nodded toward Thomas. "Dad, I think you should give a toast." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "A toast? I didn't prepare anything." "You don't have to," Maggie said. "Just speak from the heart." Thomas hesitated, then stood slowly. He held his glass with a hand that trembled only slightly, a tremble born of emotion, not fear. "I've learned more this year," he began, voice soft but steady, "about dignity, boundaries, and second chances than I ever expected to." Jason and Maggie watched him, eyes warm, encouraging. "For a long time I thought being a good father meant giving endlessly, fixing everything, absorbing every blow." He paused, breath tightening. "But I've learned that love without boundaries isn't love, it's sacrifice. And sacrifice without limits can destroy a person." He swallowed gently. "This year has been painful, but it's also shown me who's stood beside me, who's helped me heal. Jason, Maggie, thank you for giving me room to rediscover the man I used to be, and the man I want to be." He lifted his glass, to dignity, to boundaries, and to second chances wherever they're needed. They clinked their glasses together, and Maggie's smile shone with quiet pride. The meal continued with stories and laughter, Jason recounting a disastrous attempt to deep fry a turkey years back, Maggie teasing him about chores he still didn't know how to do, Thomas listening with a full, aching heart. Every bite tasted richer simply because it wasn't coated in stress. He savored each moment, each sound, each pulse of peace that filled the room. At one point, the conversation softened. The warmth of the food, the home, the company created space for truth. Thomas set down his fork. "I miss her," he said quietly. Jason didn't need clarification. "I know, Dad." "She wasn't always like this," Thomas continued. "There was a time when she was gentle, funny, bright." His voice trembled slightly. "I miss who she used to be." Maggie reached across the table, touching his hand with a soft, steadying squeeze. "Missing her doesn't mean you made the wrong choices." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know, I just hope she finds her way back. Not to my house, not yet, but back to herself." Jason leaned back, thoughtful. "Maybe the path she's on, counseling, accountability, maybe that's the first step." Thomas looked toward the candle flickering beside him, its flame small but persistent. "Maybe," he whispered. The hope wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It was gentle, tentative, the kind of hope that doesn't demand anything in return. And for now, that was enough. The morning light rose slowly over the horizon, brushing the sky with soft streaks of gold and pale blue. A thin layer of frost covered the sidewalks, sparkling under the first touch of sun. Thomas stepped outside, pulling his coat tight around him and breathed in the crisp winter air. It filled his lungs like something new, cleaner, steadier, honest in its chill. He walked down the familiar street, the one he'd traveled for decades, through seasons of raising children, grieving his wife, holding on, letting go. Today, the world felt different, not because the street had changed, but because he had. His boots crunched softly against the frost, as he let his mind drift back through everything that had brought him to this point. The slap, the shock in Sarah's eyes when she struck him, the bruise he traced with trembling fingers that night, the betrayal that carved into him deeper than any physical wound. Then the escalation, the shouting, the forged withdrawals, the police visits, the courtroom glare that had held no love at all, the bitterness, the chaos, the fear he never admitted aloud. He remembered signing the papers that felt like final lines in long-buried chapters. He remembered watching her be taken away, her anger sharp enough to pierce the cold air. And he remembered the moment, weeks later, when he finally exhaled, not in relief but in release. A small part of him still ached, a part of him always would. That ache was proof he had loved deeply. But now, walking alone beneath the early winter sun, he realized something he hadn't been able to see before. Every step, every painful decision, every boundary he had drawn, none of it had been revenge. It had been survival. Justice, he understood now, was not about punishment. It was about reclaiming the parts of himself that had been slowly eroded by years of enabling, fear, and misplaced hope. Justice was giving himself back the dignity he had quietly surrendered. Justice was choosing peace over guilt. Justice was finally allowing healing to take root. As he reached the small park at the end of the block, he paused by the fence, watching the sunlight melt the frost along the grass. His breath curled into the cold air in slow, steady clouds. Somewhere across town, Sarah was still in counseling, mandated, guided, facing her own shadows. He didn't know how long it would take for her to heal. He didn't know who she would be when she came out the other side. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that healing was possible for her. That maybe, one day, the girl she once was might find her way back, not to his house, not instantly into his life, but back to herself. The rest would be decided in time. He turned and headed home, the rhythm of his steps lighter than it had been in months. The house greeted him with warmth as he stepped inside, his breath thawing into the familiar quiet. He walked into the kitchen. The morning sun spilled across the breakfast table, the same table where everything had started. The place where he had set out a full breakfast for Sarah, hoping to talk, hoping to reach her, hoping justice could be something gentle. He pulled out the chair and sat down, letting his fingers rest on the smooth wooden surface. This table had witnessed everything. His fear, his heartbreak, his strength. It had seen the moment he realized his life needed to change. Now it witnessed the man he had become after making those changes. A man steadier, stronger, wiser, and finally whole. Thomas looked out the window at the pale winter morning, feeling the warmth of his home wrap around him like an old friend. He thought about Sarah, about the beginning, about the ending, and about the middle he had survived. And then, quietly, with a small, resolute breath, he spoke the words that had been forming in his heart since the very beginning. I served her breakfast that morning, but the justice was for me.